Well, thanks very much for coming along to this session. So we've got Michael Dello-Iacovo speaking first up. Michael is undertaking a PhD in space science at the University of New South Wales, examining planetary exploration methods. He's also the previous CEO of Effective Altruism Australia and is involved with the Animal Justice Party, including as the candidate for Heffron before in 2019, earlier this year. So, and he's also the chair for the party's youth wing. So everyone, welcome Michael.
Thanks, Courtney. Can everyone hear me okay? Is that working? Yep. Cool. Thanks for coming. I'm very excited to be here to talk about animal advocacy and hopefully effective animal advocacy. It's an area in effective altruism that I'm really passionate about. So I'm going to start off with something that's probably a little bit... if you've been around effective altruism circles before, this might not be so new, so please bear with me, but this is just to kind of set the ground. So there's three, I guess, pillars or concepts that effective altruists use to try and determine which causes are really effective, or even within a cause, what projects and things to work on. So they are scale, or that's just a measure of how big is the problem, or how good would it be if that problem just went away entirely. Solvability is a measure of how easy is it to make any ground in this problem. So a problem could be huge in scale, but maybe it's just really hard to do anything about. And the last one is neglectedness. So how neglected is this issue? You can imagine if there's an issue where a lot of people are already working on it, maybe it's hard for someone new to come in and make a lot of difference in that field. So just keep that in mind as we talk about animal advocacy and the related issues there. And then just kind of wrapping all that together is this idea of cause neutrality. So we shouldn't be tied to any one particular cause. We should instead try and think about, what are our goals? It might be reducing suffering, saving lives, something like that. But we shouldn't be too tied to any one particular cause. So when I say cause, I mean like animal advocacy is one, but also something like climate change or global health and so on. So how does animal advocacy stack up in using these metrics? So in terms of scale, it's massive. 60 to 90 billion land animals are farmed per year. So even if we're just talking about the impact on animals in industrialized animal agriculture, and trillions of marine animals are killed every year. How neglected is it? I think there are very few resources going towards this and very few people working on this issue relative to some other causes like global health, which has billions and possibly trillions of dollars of foreign aid and research going into it. How solvable is it? I think this is still kind of yet to be determined. There's, as I'll talk about in a moment, there's not a lot of research that has gone into looking at different interventions and different ways of helping animals. I'd love to see more. So I think that's yet to be determined, but I think it's promising, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. I realise this is supposed to be an introduction talk for 10 minutes, and we'll see how we go, but I might have to speed through some things a little bit. So just why should you as an effective altruist or someone interested in effective altruism care about animals? Let's say you're not fully convinced on that. So why care about non-human animals? Well, I want to spin that around a little bit and say, well, what is it about human animals? And I phrase it that way on purpose, that we care about. So is it because they can suffer? Is it because they're intelligent? Is it because they can feel emotions? I think non-human animals can feel all these things too. And maybe you can argue reasonably that perhaps to a lesser extent for some of these than humans. But if it's because they suffer, if it's because they're intelligent or feel emotions or something like that, animals feel these to an extent, and so we should definitely at least care about animals to an extent. Just to follow on from that, so maybe you say, well, humans have a lot of neurons or something, like they have very advanced developed brains. Well, chimpanzees have a lot, dogs somewhat less, pigs more than dogs, and pigs are more intelligent than dogs, which I think people find surprising. And elephants have even more neurons than humans. And this isn't necessarily a measure of intelligence, but this is a proxy sometimes people in the field use to try and gauge the different levels of intelligence of animals. So just something to keep in mind. So it's really hard to know what works. And I'm going to use an example from social programs aimed at humans, because I couldn't really think of a good example for this for animals, but I'll come back to... I'll explain the point I'm trying to make in a moment. So the example is of a program that you've probably heard many times you've been at EA talks. It's about Scared Straight. So Scared Straight is a program which operates in the US, has operated for several decades, and aims to bring children who have performed crime into the prison system, where they spend some time being yelled at, threatened and intimidated by guards and inmates. The idea being to try and scare them out of performing future crime and create a social benefit. Now, it sounds like a great idea. But unfortunately, after they did a number of randomized controlled trials on this, they actually found that the children going into this program were performing more crime than the children in similar situations who were not going into the program. So it's a great idea. The intervention just didn't really work and actually potentially caused more harm than good. The reason I say that is because it's really hard to know which programs work, and that absolutely applies to animal agriculture and to everything that we want to try and make a difference about. So this is specifically talking about social programs, but of rigorously evaluated programs, it turns out that a full 75% have little to no effect, with some small number even having a negative effect. So why should we analyse charities and interventions at all? Many people believe it's enough to donate to charities that are honest, but many honest charities have programs that don't work or can be, even in some small cases, harmful. So honest charities try to do good, and it's a good start, but our intuition isn't very good at picking good charities or programs. So, okay, well, why don't all charities just analyse their impact then? Why don't they all try and measure the impact that they're having? So randomised controlled trials are one of the best ways to try and measure impact. That's where you take two populations or two groups of individuals, you apply your program to one group of individuals, and you measure the impact of the outcomes on both over time. That costs a lot of money, so it can be a really hard sell and to the charity and to the donors. But luckily there are some organisations that do this. So GiveWell, for example, do this for human-focused charities, and then animal charity evaluators try and do this research to look at different programs, different charities, interventions that help animals, and look at the evidence there. So if you're looking for a summary of the research that exists at the moment, they're probably one of your best bets. A little bit, just as an example. So this is, on the left, we have the number of animals used and killed each year in the US in a number of different areas. So the big blue section is the number of animals used and killed in farms. So the number of animals used and killed in labs is significantly smaller. The number of animals used and killed for clothing, even smaller, and the number of animals who end up in shelters is quite small as well. But when we look at the amount of money donated to animal charities, we see that the vast majority is going towards animals in shelters. Using our framework that we talked about before of solvability, neglectedness, and scale, you could argue that within the animal cause area, farmed animals is much greater in scale, just purely by the number of animals in there than the other areas here. It's also much more neglected because there are a lot fewer resources going into that area. So, okay, so I also want to talk a little bit about the importance of goals and metrics. So what is it that we're actually trying to achieve? And I think it's really important that when we come into this space, it's important to define that. So is it more vegans, less suffering, less animals being exploited? More vegans is often used, not always, but often used as kind of a proxy for how much good you're doing for animals. And it's sort of obvious why that's the case. More vegans means fewer people consuming animal products, fewer animals being bred into intensive farming operations. But I'll sort of mix it up a little bit here. So I'm going to just skip ahead and say, so it's great to say more vegans is better, but what is the impact of creating one extra vegan or converting someone from the average Australian diet to a vegan diet or somewhere in between? So the average, this is using American data, but I think it should be fairly similar for Australian data. We have a lot of similar consumption habits. The average meat-eating American consumes 30 land animals per year, including 28 chickens. Consumes several hundred marine animals, mostly shellfish, 2 egg-laying hens per person per year, 1 dairy cow per 30 people per year, and so on. So when we talk about creating an extra vegan as being good for animals, this is how we can try and picture that. It's more complicated though. So one less product purchased does not necessarily equal one less product produced. So there's this idea of supply and demand elasticity. So you, if say you're demanding 30 of this product per year and you suddenly demand 30 fewer of those products per year, the suppliers are not going to suddenly produce 30 fewer of those products. So this is relatively well studied for some other areas of industry, less so for animal agriculture, but animal charity evaluators have estimated one extra vegan consuming 30 fewer farmed land animals results in 1.8 to 21 fewer animals being farmed. Big range because there's a lot of uncertainty. But we can see that already it's definitely less than a 1-to-1 ratio. However, not everyone who becomes vegan will stay vegan. There's this idea of recidivism where, to make it even more complicated, your impact of creating one more vegan is going to be even less than you might think, because a proportion of people who become vegan, or let's say you convince someone to consume fewer animal products, they're not going to necessarily stick to that. However, so Analytics did some research in 2014, and they suggested that working to reduce recidivism, while it might be beneficial, it's not as effective as traditional outreach and just convincing people to change their behaviors in the first place. There are a large number of different interventions that people try and undertake to either convince people to consume fewer animal products or to try and change the lives of animals directly. I don't have time to really cover them properly, but I'm just going to skim over those to give a sense of what people are doing in the movement. So there's leafleting, online ads. These are usually linked to some content, maybe some footage of animals in a farming operation to try and convince people to reduce their consumption of animal products. It's been a little bit of research on their effectiveness. So direct outreach, directly being on the streets and interacting with people about why they should change their behaviour, undercover investigations, corporate outreach, so directly working with a company to try and get them to either change their practices and how they treat animals, or to work with something like a restaurant chain to try and get them to purchase different products to supply to their consumers. A direct legal change, technological change, and this is something I'll just talk a little bit about quickly because I'm really excited and I think this has a lot of potential. So one such example would be creating a cellular agriculture product, like, for example, what people call lab meat, or essentially you're creating animal products directly out of cells rather than by raising an animal and slaughtering it. I think this has the greatest potential for change because one thing I've seen is people, just in all areas of life, are very reluctant to change their habits. And so if you can provide them with a product that tastes the same, essentially is the same, but doesn't require the suffering of animals, I think that could be a huge game changer. And I don't think it's entirely unrealistic. People are working on it now and have produced these products. The trick now is to get them to be commercially viable. But rennet is an ingredient that originally comes from the stomach of a cow, and it's used in cheese production. About 30 years ago, scientists worked out how to produce rennet directly from yeasts. So they changed the yeasts to act as rennet. And in fact, most cheese now today does not use rennet from cows. It uses this artificial rennet. So we've already done this. We just have to do it for a completely different medium. Yep. Okay. Unfortunately, I have to wrap this up. I'd want to just quickly say, how does this direct activism? So I think the main takeaway that you should take from here is we should be careful to not assume that all interventions have a positive desired effect. We should always be aware that there are ways to improve our activism, our project, whatever we're working on. And I think the most important thing now is we need more research to find the most effective ways of helping animals. It's the old adage of sharpening the axe before you go and try and cut down the tree. We really need this ground research now to work out how we can most effectively help animals. And I'll wrap it up there. Thank you.